All right, guys, so let's continue with our discussion of the Protestant Reformation and its causes today. So, the first thing I want to do, we've talked a little bit about some of the problems in the Catholic Church already, but I do want to address some of the other issues going on in the background that we have to consider. No event in history occurs in a vacuum. There are always multiple factors at play as to why any one event occurs. And during the Protestant Reformation, we have a lot of changes that are occurring very, very quickly. The first thing I want to do is talk about some of the broader patterns and shifts that we see in society. First of all, during the 15th century, what we're seeing is that, particularly in Northern Europe, but also in the Italian city-states, urban populations have much better access to education. And generally speaking, the better educated urban populations were becoming much more critical and much more vocal about their problems with the Catholic Church than rural peasants. Now, a lot of this is down to the notion that in cities, generally speaking, populations had other resources beyond the Catholic Church. They tended to be relatively wealthy. They tended to have other resources. And as a result of this, criticizing the church didn't mean that they were criticizing the one stable social structure in town. They weren't criticizing the only thing that was around. But the other issue is that when you lived in a city, you also felt sort of the connection to your local monarch to a much greater degree. Cities tended to be where kings and their court lived. And so Renaissance monarchs were gaining a lot of power during the 15th century, and they were becoming increasingly annoyed with the power of the church trying to limit its authority. Additionally, society throughout the Renaissance had become more humanistic, more secular, particularly in the upper echelons. Not so much for the peasants. Remember, they're not very much exposed at all to the Renaissance. But for people who are nobles, for people who are intellectuals, society is becoming a lot more humanistic. Like, people are thinking about individuals, about the world, about what the world is like outside of religion, and all of that is really important. Plus, you have growing individualism. You have this emphasis on trying to think for yourself, understand power for yourself, that it's okay for you to take pride in the work that you do. And all of those changes are going to shift the way that people think. Plus, we really have to wrestle with the changes to access to information. This grumpy looking fellow on the right here, that is Johannes Gutenberg. Gutenberg, you should know that name. He is the inventor of movable type and the printing press in Western Europe. He is from the Holy Roman Empire. He's from one of the Germanic states. And he essentially takes an Eastern Asian idea of movable type and he adds it onto a European style wine press, changes out the wooden blocks for lead type, and comes out with a new method of printing that is going to be so much more efficient than the old copy by hand method. Plus, paper became cheaper and easier to make during this period too. It used to be all done with rag. It was done with cotton rag. And now there's a new technique of making paper that also had come from East Asia that makes paper a whole heck of a lot cheaper for people, which means that paper is cheaper, which means that the words printed on the paper are cheaper, which means more people can afford to buy literature, can buy newspapers, can buy books, although they weren't called newspapers, they were broadsheets. And what this meant was that rapidly printed material could criticize the Catholic Church, could spread like wildfire far before the church could shut it down. So it's not just people criticizing the church word of mouth, like person to person. Now you have people sitting down and writing essays about this stuff, printing it up on sheets of paper and sending it a long distance. And these ideas travel and they spread and they encourage new and different ideas. And so this printing material intensifies the intellectual criticism of the church. In the previous slide, I'm actually going to go back so you can take a look at him because we didn't talk about him with the Renaissance. This fellow right here is a Catholic priest by the name of Erasmus, but Erasmus was a reformer within the Catholic Church. He wrote books upon books and essays upon essays about why the church was being sinful. He was a devout Catholic, but even he saw the problems within the church and he wrote about them. And his writings gained traction. And so you have people who are speaking openly about this for the first time. So what we tend to see, however, is that therefore these ideas that criticize the Catholic Church, they tend to appeal to the literate population because that's who has access to them. And it's not just the nobles anymore who can read, but it's largely just people in cities and just people wealthy enough to afford tutors for their children. So generally speaking, the peasants out in the countryside are illiterate. They're not able to read. They don't have good access to education. And even if they did, they're so reliant on the Catholic Church because there is nothing else to support them that it would go against their own interest to criticize the church. So Protestant ideas tend to be things that focused in on cities, on populations that were economically well enough off to be able to kind of risk the church's anger. And it generally meant that you were literate. That's where you had the hotbed of Protestantism. Now, let's talk a little bit about the political situation. So that's sort of the intellectual and social situation around Western Europe that lays the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation. Let's talk about politics. Okay, so in England, we haven't talked about England yet. In England, we got this guy who you've probably seen that picture before. I certainly hope you will. You have. Fun fact, that type of painting is quite literally called a swagger portrait. That is the name of that style of painting where you've got like the person with their hands kind of on their hips and their legs spread really wide. It's a swagger portrait. So in England as of the 15th century, there had been a long and nasty civil war in England for several generations. It had been called the War of the Roses, and actually Game of Thrones is very loosely based on it, very loosely based on it. But the new ruling family in England were the Tudors, and that is where Henry is from, Henry VIII right here. Henry VIII was the second of the Tudor rulers. His dad, Henry VII, had been the first, and his dad had been the one to end the War of the Roses. So Henry is really concerned that if he can't guarantee a smooth transition to his heir, that England will devolve again into another civil war. And that means, according to English law at this time, he needs a son. He needs a legitimate son. He needs a son born by his wife. Now, Henry had plenty of sons. They just weren't born by his wife. But as of this telling, Henry had a big problem. And that was that his wife, Catherine of Aragon, a princess of Spain, the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, the people who sponsored Columbus, she is like super Catholic, as is Henry at this time. And they only have one surviving child. And that one surviving child is a girl. And that is a problem for Henry. He's afraid that if he dies and his daughter Mary is the only surviving legitimate heir to the crown, that there will be another civil war in England. Plus, Henry has a wandering eye, and he's becoming increasingly interested in a woman called Anne Boleyn. So that's the backstory in England, because England is going to shift to Protestantism, just like some other places in Western Europe. And part of the reason why England does this is not about religious fervor, it's about politics. So that's the backstory in England. In the German states, remember, Holy Roman Empire is HRE. In the German states, you have this guy over here. And yes, If you were about to say he looks like Lord Farquaad from Shrek, yes, he does. Every time I see him, it makes me laugh. So in the Holy Roman Empire, remember the Holy Roman Empire wasn't particularly holy, wasn't very Roman, and definitely not much of an empire. Most of the states that are still technically part of the Holy Roman Empire as of the 15th century are self-sustaining. They rule themselves, but they do technically have an emperor who's in charge of them. But it's decentralized politics, meaning that it's very hard to control everything going on there. Here, because the monarchs are kind of like decentralized, the Pope is actually able to influence a lot of policy. But at the time of this telling, at the beginning of the 16th century, the Holy Roman Emperor is Charles V. He's Spanish. He's of the Spanish crown. And he is young. He's only 18 when he becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, and he's politically insecure. He's been raised for this job, but you can train all day long for a new type of job, but until you actually get out and do it, you don't know what you're doing. So he's young, he's politically untested, he doesn't have a whole lot of allies, and he's trying to govern a massive realm, including Spain. By this time, by the early 16th century, there's contact in the Americas, so technically he's in charge of parts of the Americas too. And he's trying to govern this territory that is facing massive political upheaval due to this one problematic priest. And that's going to be an issue. Plus, Charles V is also facing a war. He's fighting the Ottoman Turks and he's fighting France at the same time. So, Charles V is super busy and he really can't pay attention to what's going on in the German states. And so, as a result, the circumstances in the Holy Roman Empire are going to favor this young priest by the name of Luther. So, let us talk for a moment about Luther. So, now, that's Luther. So, Martin Luther, was a German monk. He actually had trained as a lawyer and then had a moment of conversion. And he was really into studying the scripture. He was a really dedicated scholar of biblical text. And he was extraordinarily troubled by the sale of indulgences. He was like, I have read the Old Testament, I have read the New, I've read it in the original, I've read it in Hebrew and ancient Greek, and I do not understand where the church is getting the idea that you can sell time off of purgatory through indulgences. It's not in the text. There's nothing in there about that. And so Luther becomes increasingly upset when a Dominican friar, Saint Dominic, not Dominican Republic, Saint Dominic, a Dominican friar by the name of Tetzel comes to the city in which Luther is living and working. And this is the city of Wittenberg. And he comes in 1517. And Tetzel starts selling indulgences. And this is just like a bridge too far for Luther. So Luther decides, no, this cannot happen. So on October 31st, of 1517, which everybody is like, he did it on Halloween. No, he did it the day before All Saints' Days. So what he did was he wrote up this list of 95 reasons why indulgences are wrong, basically his criticisms of the Catholic Church. And he posted it to the door of the castle church, which everyone is like, that's a power move, but dude, everybody posted everything to the church door because it was sort of like the meeting house, and it'd be like posting it on a message board. Everyone would see it if you posted it there. So it wasn't really a power move, it was just sensible. So Luther posts his 95 thesis on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg on October 31st. And it's this direct criticism of the Catholic Church. Now, initially, nobody particularly cared. Some people around the city were kind of, affronted by this, but Luther doesn't shut up about it. He starts preaching about it when he's in the pulpit. He writes a number of essays and has them printed up and handed out, and slowly he gets drawn into this really heated debate. The Pope initially doesn't particularly care about Luther. just a problematic guy. But then Luther writes massive attacks about the Pope, and he is excommunicated from the Catholic Church. When Luther receives the information that he's been excommunicated, he takes the letter and he burns it publicly, basically saying, like, so what? Come and get me. So then the Pope actually sends men after Luther, and Luther has to go into hiding. While Luther is in hiding, he translates the New Testament into German, which the Catholic Church says is a sin. So this is the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Are you on Team Luther or are you on Team Pope? I have a video I want you to watch on Luther, and then you're going to do a learning check for me.